The glass shattered first. Then came the scream high and panicked, cutting through the clink of wine glasses and the hum of polite conversation. I looked up from the sink, my hands submerged in gray dishwater, and saw a man crumple to the floor of the dining room like a puppet with its strings cut. Every instinct I had spent 15 years sharpening surged through me at once. I dropped the plate I was holding and ran. My brother stepped directly into my path, one hand raised, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Stay back, you're just a dishwasher." He had no idea those words were about to unravel everything he'd built. My name is Nicole Turner. 6 years ago, I wore the rank of Major in the United States Army Medical Corps. I was a trauma surgeon who had spent 3 deployments elbow deep in wounds that would have stopped most people's hearts. That night, I was standing in the kitchen of my own brother's restaurant wearing an apron that smelled like bleach and old grease, because that was the only work anyone would give a convicted felon. Turner House was Ethan's pride, a glossy steakhouse downtown that catered to businessmen, city councilmen, and retired officers who liked to be reminded that patriotism tasted good with a $30 cut of ribeye. That evening, a private fundraiser filled the dining room with exactly that crowd. I wasn't invited to it, not really. I was invited to scrub the pots it dirtied. When the man collapsed, I could see from across the room that something was blocking his airway, or his heart had simply stopped. I told Ethan to call for an ambulance and bring the defibrillator mounted near the host stand. Instead, he squared his shoulders and raised his voice again. "You're not a doctor anymore. You're a convicted felon." Heads turned. I watched pity and contempt pass over the faces of strangers who didn't know a single true thing about me. I was about to push past him anyway, my body already dropping into the crouch I'd used 100 times in field hospitals, when an older man in dress uniform stepped forward from the crowd. He moved the way career soldiers move even decades after retirement, economical and sure. He looked at me, and something in his expression changed from concern to disbelief. "Oh my God," he said quietly. "It's her." My brother thought those words would expose me. He had no idea they were about to expose him. To understand how I ended up washing dishes in my own brother's restaurant, you have to go back 6 years to a version of my life I barely recognize now. I had built a career the Army was proud of. I specialized in trauma surgery, the kind of work where you don't get the luxury of hesitation. I was stationed overseas twice, then rotated through a military hospital stateside where I trained younger surgeons in triage under pressure. Colleagues respected me. My commanding officers trusted me with cases other surgeons wouldn't touch. Inside my own family, that respect looked different. I had simply always been the one who succeeded. Ethan was the charming one, quick with a joke, easy in a room, but underneath that charm sat a resentment he never fully hid. He used to say I only made it because I wore a uniform and had the government protecting me, as if discipline and sacrifice were handed out like rations. I let the comment slide more times than I can count because he was my brother, and because I believed foolishly that blood meant loyalty. When our father passed, I inherited enough money to open something I dreamed about since my first deployment, a surgical center built specifically for veterans who couldn't afford the procedures they needed after their service ended. I threw myself into that work completely. I trusted my brother, who had a business degree and an easy way with numbers, to manage the financial side while I handled the operating room. It felt natural. It felt like family taking care of family. It was the worst mistake of my life. I didn't know it then. Standing in scrubs instead of an apron signing off on patient charts, I believed in completely. I didn't know that while I was saving lives in one room, my brother was quietly building a different story in another one, written in falsified records and diverted funds. One that would end with my name attached to a dead man and a prison sentence instead of a medical license. I had handed him the books without a second thought. What I didn't know was that he had already begun writing the story that would send me to prison. The surgical center grew faster than either of us expected. Within 18 months, we had a waiting list of veterans who needed procedures the VA couldn't schedule for months, sometimes years. I handled every consultation, every operation, every follow-up appointment personally when I could manage it. Ethan handled the invoices, the anesthesia orders, the insurance contracts, and the accounts that kept the doors open. It seemed like the perfect division of labor. I was good at saving lives. He was good, or so I believed, at keeping the business alive around me. The first signs were small enough to dismiss. Pain medication costs climbed month over month in a way that didn't match our patient volume. Patient files showed prescription refills I didn't remember authorizing. Payments from insurance companies would appear on one ledger and vanish from another before reconciliation. When I asked Ethan about the discrepancies, he'd wave a hand and promise to look into it. When I pushed harder, he'd delay the audit again, citing a vendor dispute or a software migration or some other excuse that always sounded plausible enough to buy him another month. I remember the exact night I decided to stop asking gently. I found him in the office after hours, and I laid 3 mismatched invoices on the desk in front of him. He looked at them, then at me, and his face shifted into something wounded, something performed. "You trusted strangers in uniform more than your own brother," he said, and I felt the old guilt creep in, the one he'd been cultivating in me since we were kids. He was good at that. He always had been. Family loyalty was the lever he pulled whenever the truth got too close. 3 weeks later, a patient named Daniel Mercer died. Daniel was 52, a veteran who'd come to us for a routine procedure to repair nerve damage from an old combat injury. He should have walked out of recovery within a day. Instead, he died from what the medical examiner ruled an opioid overdose administered during a period when, according to the electronic records, I had personally approved an unusually high dosage. I remember staring at that chart in disbelief. I hadn't approved it. I hadn't even been in the building that afternoon. But the signature was mine, time-stamped and logged, sitting in the system like an accusation with my name already attached. When investigators dug deeper, they found hundreds of missing opioid units traced back to our pharmacy records, all authorized under my electronic credentials. Ethan played the grieving business partner, beautifully telling police, and later prosecutors, that I had changed since my last deployment, that I'd struggled with sleep, with stress, with what he called the weight of the war. He handed over emails, ones I never wrote, in which I supposedly asked him to help cover discrepancies in the medication logs. I sat across from investigators and told the truth, and watched it mean nothing against paperwork that looked airtight. My attorney urged me to accept a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. I refused. I believed with the kind of stubbornness that had kept me alive through 2 deployments that facts would eventually win. I was wrong about how fast, and I was wrong about who controlled the facts. There was one person who could have proven the records were altered, a young systems administrator named Caleb Morris, who managed our patient database. Days before the trial, he disappeared. No forwarding address, no phone number that worked, no explanation. The prosecution simply moved forward without him, and my defense lost. The one witness who might have shown the timeline didn't add up. Ethan testified against me. I still remember him on the stand, his voice cracking at exactly the right moments. "She's my sister," he said, dabbing at eyes that never actually produced tears. "I wish I could protect her, but a man is dead." The jury believed him completely. I watched their faces soften with sympathy for him and harden with judgment toward me, and there was nothing I could do but sit there in my dress uniform, the same uniform I'd worn through 2 combat deployments, and absorb it. I was convicted of unauthorized prescribing medical fraud and negligence resulting in a patient's death. I lost my medical license. I was discharged from the Army under circumstances that erased 15 years of honorable service from how anyone would remember me. Before the bailiff led me out of the courtroom, Ethan leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You always had to be the hero," he whispered. "Now everyone knows what you really are." While I sat in a federal prison, learning to measure time in meals and head counts, my brother moved fast. He sold the surgical center I'd built quietly before anyone could ask too many questions about its finances. He took control of what remained of our family's assets. He bought a large house in a neighborhood our parents never could have afforded. He opened Turner House, a steakhouse that positioned itself in every press release and charity gala invitation. As a business built by a man devoted to helping veterans, I understood, sitting in a cell reading about his grand opening in a newspaper another inmate had left behind, exactly where that opening capital had come from. It came from the center I'd built with my inheritance and my hands. It came from money he'd stolen while I took the blame for a dead man he'd helped kill. Prison taught me patience. A surgeon doesn't cut until she knows exactly where the damage is. I was released after almost 4 years early for good behavior, though nothing about walking out of those gates felt like an early gift. I carried 1 bag of clothes, a few $100s, the prison called gate money, and nothing else. No medical license, no military honor, no family waiting at the curb. I stood in the parking lot for a long time before I called a cab, because for 4 years someone had told me exactly where to be every hour of every day, and suddenly no one was telling me anything at all. Finding work proved harder than I expected, even for someone who once held 11 hours of a man's life steady in her hands. Every application asked the same question, and every honest answer to it closed a door. Restaurants, clinics, warehouses, it didn't matter. A felony conviction for medical fraud and a patient's death followed me into every interview like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I told myself I wouldn't ask Ethan for anything. Then I thought about my mother. Alone in a nursing facility with a monthly bill I couldn't cover, and pride became a luxury I no longer had. Ethan called before I could bring myself to call him. His voice was warm, generous, almost paternal, as though the last 4 years had never happened. "I'm willing to give you a second chance," he said, and I remember gripping the phone hard enough that my knuckles ached. He offered me a position at Turner House with conditions delivered so smoothly they almost sounded reasonable. I would work only in the kitchen. I would never speak to customers. I would never mention the army. Never mention surgery. Never let a single employee learn that the dishwasher was his sister. He said it was to protect the restaurant's reputation. We both knew the truth. He wanted the pleasure of watching the sister everyone once admired scrub his pots. The humiliations came steadily, almost casually, the way people deliver cruelty when they've decided it's owed to them. He called me prison doc in front of the staff. He docked my pay for mistakes that never happened. He scheduled me for shifts that stretched past midnight without overtime, then reminded me I should be grateful for the work at all. He told new hires within earshot that I had once killed a patient, letting the words hang there without context, without mercy. I said nothing. 4 years in a federal facility teaches you which battles are worth the cost of fighting them in the open, and which ones you win by simply watching. And there was a great deal worth watching at Turner House. Vendor invoices came through the kitchen printer sometimes, and I noticed the numbers didn't match what actually arrived in the delivery trucks. Cash transactions from private events never seemed to make it into the ledger Ethan kept locked in his office. He'd started a veterans charity drive under the restaurant's name, soliciting donations from wealthy regulars, and I never once saw evidence that any of that money reached an actual veteran. I found an ally in Maria Alvarez, the kitchen manager, a single mother who'd worked for Ethan longer than anyone else on staff. She was careful with what she said at first, the way people are when they've learned trust is expensive, but over weeks of late shifts, we developed something like friendship. She told me Ethan routinely threatened employees without legal status, holding their jobs over their heads, and skimmed tips meant for the waitstaff. She said it quietly, glancing toward the office door, and I understood she'd been carrying that knowledge alone for a long time. Then on an ordinary Tuesday evening, I saw Caleb Morris. He was working as a freelance maintenance contractor, fixing a walk-in cooler that had been cycling warm all week. I recognized him instantly, even 4 years older, even in a different uniform. He'd been the systems administrator who managed our patient database at the surgical center, the man who vanished right before my trial. The one witness who could have shown my signature had been forged. When his eyes found mine across the kitchen, his face drained of color. He didn't say a word. He gathered his tools and left before his shift was finished, and he didn't come back the following week. I stood there holding a stack of dirty plates, watching the door swing shut behind him, and something clicked into place that I'd wondered about for 4 long years. I had always assumed Caleb disappeared on his own, frightened into silence by a trial he wanted no part of. Seeing him here working quietly for a contractor connected to my brother's restaurant told me something different. He hadn't vanished. Ethan had hidden him the same way he'd hidden the truth, tucked away just close enough to control. For 4 years I had wondered whether Ethan acted alone. The moment Caleb saw me, I had my answer. Turner House announced a fundraiser called Heroes at Home, and Ethan promoted it for weeks as his proudest event, yet a night dedicated to supporting military families. He printed the flyers himself, insisted on premium ingredients for the menu, and reminded the staff a dozen times that this event mattered more than any other on the calendar. I understood why the moment I saw the guest list taped inside the kitchen door. The evening's guest of honor was retired General Robert Callahan. I recognized the name immediately, though I never expected he'd remember mine. Years earlier, during my second deployment, I had spent 11 hours in a field hospital operating on a senior officer brought in after an explosion tore through his convoy. The mission records were sealed, the patient's identity never released beyond the medical team that treated him. I had assumed all these years later that he was simply another name in a file I wasn't permitted to discuss with anyone, including myself. The dining room filled with donors, local officials, and men in blazers who wore their old service pins like badges of belonging. I stayed in the kitchen where Ethan insisted I remain scrubbing pans, while laughter and the clink of glasses drifted through the swinging doors. Then the sound changed. A chair scraped hard against the floor. Someone gasped. I heard a voice call for help in the particular pitch that means something has gone seriously wrong, and I was moving before I'd fully processed why. A man had collapsed near the center table. I recognized him from the flyer, Senator James Whitmore, the event's other guest of honor. He was clutching at his throat, his face reddening, then paling, his body sliding sideways out of his chair. Choking, possibly cardiac, I couldn't be sure from across the room, but I knew I had seconds, not minutes, to find out. I pushed through the kitchen doors and Ethan stepped directly into my path again, exactly as he had the first time, his palm raised like a barrier. "Stay back," he shouted loud enough for the whole room to hear him a second time. "She's not a doctor. She's my dishwasher." I felt every eye in the room land on me, the same mixture of pity and suspicion I remembered from years ago, except this time I didn't have 4 years left to serve. This time I had a man dying on the floor in front of me. That was when General Callahan rose from his seat. He crossed the room with the same economical stride I'd noticed once before, and he stopped in front of me, studying my face. My voice, the small scar along the back of my right hand, from a piece of shrapnel I'd never bothered to have removed. Recognition moved across his features slowly, then, all at once. "Major Turner," he said, and the entire dining room went silent around us. Ethan tried to laugh it off. "She's not a major. She's my dishwasher." Callahan didn't even look at him. "That woman operated on me for 11 hours while our field hospital was under attack," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I'd trust her with my life before I'd trust anyone else in this building. I didn't have a license to practice medicine anymore, but the law still allowed me to render emergency aid to save a life, and I wasn't going to let a technicality cost this man his." I dropped to my knees beside Senator Whitmore, checked his airway, and found the obstruction. I worked quickly, calmly directing a stunned waiter to bring me a defibrillator, mounted near the entrance, guiding another through basic support while I cleared the blockage. Within a minute, the senator began breathing on his own color, returning to his face before the paramedics even arrived. General Callahan knelt beside me the entire time, and once the senator was stable, he addressed me by my old rank in front of the room and thanked me publicly for what I'd done. Ethan tried to interject, reminding everyone that I was a convicted felon, that I had no business being praised for anything. Callahan turned to him with an expression I recognized from years of watching senior officers assess a threat. He said he'd heard about the conviction, the falsified prescriptions, and he said something that stopped me cold. He remembered that I had refused strong pain medication, even after my own combat injuries, because I'd always been cautious to the point of stubbornness about opioids. The story the courtroom had told him didn't match the woman he remembered. A local reporter covering the fundraiser had captured the entire scene on her phone. Within hours, the footage was spreading online, under a headline that made my stomach turn and my chest tighten at once. "Convicted dishwasher saves. Senator retired general calls her a war hero." Ethan was furious, though he hid it well until the guests had gone. He pulled me into his office and told me I was finished at Turner House, that I'd embarrassed him in front of people who mattered. I looked at him calm in a way that surprised even me. "You should fire me," I said, "because I won't be washing dishes tomorrow." Before he left the building that night, General Callahan found me by the back entrance and pressed his card into my hand. "Tell me everything," he said. "This time you're not fighting alone." General Callahan didn't waste time on sympathy. 2 days after the fundraiser, he called me himself and gave me the number of a woman named Colonel Rebecca Shaw, a retired military attorney who had spent the last decade untangling wrongful convictions and fraud cases involving veterans. He told me to call her before I did anything else, and something in his voice made it clear this wasn't a suggestion I should ignore. Rebecca reviewed my case files within a week, and she found the same holes I'd sensed for years, but never had the resources to prove. The electronic signatures on my prescription approvals had timestamps that placed me at a military training facility in another state on the exact days I supposedly authorized those medications. The hospital's security footage from the weeks the pain medication went missing had been deleted, all of it, in a way that suggested deliberate erasure rather than routine data loss. Bank records showed Ethan received a substantial payment shortly after my conviction funneled through an account that had no obvious connection to the restaurant or the surgical center. And Caleb Morris, the one witness who understood the hospital's record system better than anyone, had never once been called to testify, despite being the administrator responsible for the very system at the center of the case. Maria gave me something Rebecca hadn't expected, either copies of restaurant invoices she'd quietly kept for her own protection over the years, showing Ethan moving money through a series of shell companies with names too generic to draw attention. One of those companies, buried 3 transactions deep, had once received a wire transfer from the surgical center's operating account, back when I still believed every dollar was going toward patient care. I went to find Caleb myself. He refused to speak with me at first, ducking behind half-closed doors, clearly terrified of what Ethan might do if he learned we'd talked. I didn't threaten him, and I didn't plead. I told him about Daniel Mercer instead, about a man who died believing I'd been careless with his care, about a widow who had spent 4 years hating the wrong person. I watched something break in Caleb's face as I spoke, the weight of it finally too heavy to keep carrying alone. He told me everything. Ethan had been stealing opioids from the surgical center for over a year, selling them through a distribution network he'd built quietly on the side. When Daniel began asking questions about missing medication and threatened to report what he'd noticed, Ethan altered his prescription records to cover the theft, and the altered dosage killed him. To make the fraud untraceable, Ethan forced Caleb to use his administrator credentials to forge my electronic signature across dozens of records. He paid Caleb enough to disappear before the trial and kept him quiet ever since, with a mixture of money and fear. Caleb told me there was a backup hard drive one Ethan kept as insurance against his own accomplices, containing the original unaltered medical records, before anything had been changed. That hard drive was locked inside a safe in Ethan's office at Turner House. I wanted it desperately, but Rebecca stopped me before I did anything reckless. Evidence taken illegally could be thrown out of court entirely, and after everything I'd already lost to a broken system, I wasn't going to hand my brother another advantage. Instead, Rebecca worked with federal investigators to secure a search warrant building the request around Caleb's sworn statement and the financial trail Maria had helped uncover. Ethan sensed something shifting before the warrant arrived. He must have learned that Caleb had spoken to me, because within days he called a press conference at the restaurant, standing in front of cameras, to declare that his sister was exploiting a senator's near-death experience to rewrite a criminal past she couldn't outrun. He looked directly into the lens and said, "I had always believed the rules didn't apply to me, that I was dangerous, that people should be careful around someone capable of what I'd supposedly done." I didn't respond publicly. I let him talk because every word he added was another thread for investigators to pull, another contradiction between what he'd claimed under oath years ago and what he was claiming now in front of cameras. The more he spoke, the more he unraveled the story he'd spent 6 years perfecting. He was still mid-sentence, still performing outrage for the reporters gathered outside Turner House, when 2 black sedans pulled up along the curb behind him. My brother had spent 6 years preparing speeches. He had never prepared for a search warrant. Federal agents moved through Turner House, methodically sealing off the office, while Ethan was still standing in front of the cameras trying to explain who they were. I watched from across the street with Rebecca beside me, my arms crossed tight against my chest, feeling something settle in me that I hadn't felt in 6 years. Not triumph exactly, something steadier than that. They found the hard drive exactly where Caleb said it would be, locked in the safe, behind a framed photo of Ethan shaking hands with a city councilman. Alongside it, they recovered a ledger detailing years of opioid diversion and illegal sales email threads between Ethan and Caleb, discussing how to alter my prescription records, wire transfers to accounts overseas, and financial documents showing Ethan had systematically drained the veterans' charity fund he'd built his public image around. Buried deeper in the files was something I hadn't expected to find: records proving he'd redirected a portion of our father's estate meant for me while I was still incarcerated, funneling it into the same accounts that financed his restaurant. Agents arrested him inside the building he'd used for years to humiliate me, in the same dining room where he'd once shouted that I was nothing but a dishwasher. He looked at me across the room as they read him his rights, his face contorted with something between rage and disbelief. "You did this to your own brother," he shouted loud enough that a few remaining reporters lifted their cameras again. I didn't raise my voice to match his. "No," I said. "I just stopped protecting you from what you did. My case reopened within weeks." Rebecca presented the timestamp discrepancies to the court, showing that at the exact hour I supposedly approved the fatal dosage for Daniel Mercer, I had been 3 states away completing a mandatory recertification course at a military training facility with dozens of witnesses and sign-in logs to prove it. General Callahan testified on my behalf, speaking to the court about my character, my caution around pain medication, even in my own recovery, and the 11 hours I'd spent keeping him alive under fire. Caleb took the stand as well, admitting his role in falsifying the records, describing in detail how Ethan had coerced him and what it had cost him to stay silent for so long. His voice shook through most of it, but he didn't stop until the whole truth was on record. Daniel Mercer's widow was there too. For 4 years, she had believed I killed her husband through negligence, and I understood why she hadn't been able to look at me during the first trial. This time, she sat through every hour of testimony, and something in her expression changed as the pieces came together. Ethan hadn't just destroyed my career. He'd taken her husband's life to protect a drug operation, then let a decorated surgeon absorb the blame so cleanly that no one thought to look further. The judge vacated my conviction entirely. I remember standing in that courtroom, feeling the weight of 6 years lift in a way that didn't feel like relief so much as exhaustion. The kind that comes after holding your breath for far too long. "Ms. Turner," the judge said, "the justice system failed you." I thought about every version of myself the system had tried to erase: the surgeon, the officer, the sister who trusted the wrong person with everything she'd built. "Then make sure it doesn't fail the next person," I told him. Ethan's charges piled up faster than even Rebecca had predicted. Falsifying evidence, perjury, illegal distribution of controlled substances, insurance fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, theft of inherited assets, charity fraud tied to the Veterans Fund he'd used to build his public reputation. Turner House closed within days of his arrest, its assets frozen pending trial. The dining room that once hosted galas, now dark behind taped-off doors. He tried through his attorney to negotiate a lighter sentence, and as part of that effort he asked to see me. He wanted a letter, something expressing that our family had suffered enough, something a judge might read as evidence of reconciliation. I went to the visitation room more out of curiosity than compassion, wondering what version of himself he'd present this time. He looked smaller across that table than I remembered, the charm worn thin under fluorescent light. He told me we were family, that our parents would never have wanted to see him destroyed this way, that surely I understood loyalty meant something even now. I sat there and let him finish, and when he was done I reminded him that he'd said something almost identical to a jury 6 years earlier, standing in a witness box, calling himself my protector while he ensured I went to prison for a crime he committed. I told him I wouldn't write the letter. I told him I wasn't interested in destroying him the way he'd tried to destroy me, with lies dressed up as concern. I wasn't going to lie for him, and I wasn't going to lie about him either. I was simply going to let the truth he'd spent so long burying finally see daylight and let him answer for what it revealed. I didn't raise my voice when I left that room. I didn't need to. Revenge, I had learned somewhere in those 4 years of silence, doesn't always look like fury. Sometimes it looks like walking away calm, while the person who wronged you is finally forced to sit with everything they built on someone else's ruin. He had taken my name, my career, and 4 years of my life. But the one thing he could never steal was the truth. Being cleared of every charge didn't hand me my old life back the way I imagined it might, during those long nights in prison staring at a ceiling and rehearsing the day my name would be clean again. Vindication turned out to be a beginning, not a finish line. I had to petition the state medical board to reinstate my license, which meant sitting through hearings where strangers asked me to prove all over again that I was competent to hold a scalpel. I had to complete supervised clinical evaluations most surgeons half my experience never faced. I found a therapist who specialized in trauma among returning veterans, and discovered somewhat to my own surprise that 4 years of incarceration had left marks on me that combat never had. I had to relearn how to trust the people around me, one small decision at a time, after spending years watching trust get twisted into a weapon. The Army reviewed my discharge records and formally restored my honor, correcting a file that had painted me for 6 years as something I never was. I didn't return to full-time military medicine. Too much time had passed, and I'd changed too much to simply slide back into the life I'd left behind. Instead, I became a consultant for a veterans healthcare initiative, reviewing cases, training younger surgeons on trauma protocols, and advocating for stronger oversight in how military medical records were handled and protected. General Callahan didn't stop at testifying for me. He helped me establish something I'd wanted to build since the day Daniel Mercer died, believing I had failed him. We named it the Daniel Mercer Trauma Foundation, dedicated to trauma care for veterans, opioid abuse prevention within military healthcare systems, support for medical professionals wrongfully accused, and legal aid for military families caught in situations like mine. Maria left the restaurant industry behind and became the foundation's operations manager, finally working somewhere that valued her the way she deserved. Caleb, after cooperating fully with prosecutors and serving his own sentence, spent his time afterward working quietly to help other survivors of financial exploitation, trying in whatever small way he could to repair what his silence had once cost. Daniel's widow came to see me privately months after the trial ended. She sat across from me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "I hated you for years," she finally said, and I could hear how much that admission cost her. "You believed what the evidence told you," I answered. "My brother made sure it told the wrong story." She reached into her bag and placed her husband's old military identification card on the table between us, asking if I would keep it somewhere in the foundation's office, somewhere his memory could mean something more than a lie told in a courtroom. I promised her I would, and I have. Turner House was sold to satisfy restitution for Ethan's victims, and the court eventually returned to me the portion of our family's inheritance he'd stolen while I sat in a cell unable to defend myself. I didn't want to keep the building. I couldn't imagine walking through those doors and feeling anything but the years I'd lost there. Instead, I turned it into a recovery center for veterans and for people newly released from prison. Men and women searching for the same second chance no one had been willing to offer me when I walked out those gates with nothing but a bag of clothes and a few $100s. On opening day, I stood in what used to be that same kitchen, the one where I'd spent months scrubbing pots while my brother paraded his stolen success through the dining room beyond. A young woman was working near the sink, newly released, still learning how to hold her head up in a world that judged her before it knew her. She hadn't told anyone here about her record, afraid of exactly what I used to fear. I walked over and handed her a folder of vocational training materials the foundation offered every new client. "This isn't where your story ends," I told her, and I watched something in her shoulders ease just slightly the way mine once had when someone finally believed I deserved a chance. General Callahan came to the ceremony that day, standing near the back in his dress uniform, even though no one had asked him to wear it. Afterward, he asked if I remembered the night he first recognized me across that crowded dining room. I told him I remembered every word. "I didn't recognize a convicted woman," he said. "I recognized the officer who refused to let a man die." I've carried that sentence with me ever since, on the days when doubt still creeps back in. My brother made me a dishwasher because he wanted me to forget who I was. But when that man collapsed, I remembered. I wasn't the woman Ethan had created in court. I was still Major Nicole Turner. I was still a surgeon. And this time, when I stepped forward, no one could make me stay back. I keep thinking about how many people out there have their own version of this story, a truth buried under someone else's lie, waiting for the right moment to finally step forward. I'd love to know what you think would have happened if that senator had collapsed on any other night. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I was writing it. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth doesn't disappear just because it's been buried. We bring you a story like this every single day, so subscribe now so you never miss the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.